They laughed when the maintenance dad raised his hand, said school policy wasn't a place for tool belt opinions, and reminded him who really funded the district. He didn't argue, just nodded and checked the ceiling above them. Minutes later, the superintendent stood and called him Sir, because titles don't always reveal true authority. Before I show you the exact moment when the superintendent's voice changed and the entire room went silent. By the way, where are you watching from? Tell me in the comments below. What looked like a routine parent meeting was never about policy. It was about power, who gets heard, and who gets humiliated. The laughter didn't echo for long, but it lingered. Elias Rowan stood near the back row of folding chairs, work boots still dusted with drywall powder, navy maintenance shirt creased from a 12-hour shift. He hadn't planned to speak. He rarely did. But when the projector screen displayed the renovation blueprint for the auditorium ceiling, something in his chest tightened. He had seen stress fractures like that before. Marla Whitcomb lowered her microphone slowly, her smile polished enough to cut glass. Designer heels crossed at the ankle, gold bracelet catching fluorescent light. "We appreciate everyone's enthusiasm," she'd said moments earlier, voice syrup smooth. "But we'll leave structural decisions to the professionals." A few parents chuckled. He felt Lila shift beside him, her small hand tightening around his fingers. She looked up, searching his face for something. Anger. Maybe embarrassment. What she found instead was stillness. The single dad's shoulders didn't tense. His jaw didn't clench. He simply looked upward again, eyes scanning the metal support beams above the auditorium stage as if the laughter had been background noise. Storm clouds pressed against the high windows, dark and swollen. The air inside felt heavier than it should have. Marla continued speaking about fundraising tiers and naming rights. Platinum donors would have their names engraved along the renovated entrance. Silver sponsors would receive front-row seating at events. The room hummed with approval. Elias heard something else. A faint, almost imperceptible tick, metal contracting against mounting brackets. Subtle. Easy to miss unless you'd once stood beneath helicopter hangars in desert heat, calculating load tolerances while wind-battered steel ribs. He exhaled slowly. Vice Principal Doreen Vale noticed him glance upward again, her brow furrowed just slightly. She'd seen him work after hours, repairing things no one else noticed were broken. Quiet. Efficient. Uncomplaining, but Marla noticed none of that. "Let's focus on realistic input," she added, eyes flicking briefly toward the back row, not hypotheticals. Another ripple of soft laughter. Leela's cheeks burned. "Dad," she whispered. He squeezed her hand once. "It's okay," he murmured, voice low and even. No tremor, no resentment, just certainty. What no one in that room understood was that he wasn't embarrassed, he was calculating. The blueprint displayed on the projector was missing a reinforcement beam along the eastern span. The existing structure was already older than most of the teachers seated in those folding chairs. Add increased lighting rigs, new sound systems, storm pressure. The numbers in his mind aligned like disciplined soldiers. Superintendent Howard Klein adjusted his tie near the stage, nodding approvingly at Marla's presentation. Optics mattered. Donor confidence mattered. Public image mattered. Above them, unseen, the building listened to the storm. Rain began tapping against the glass panels high above. Light at first, then heavier. Elias felt the vibration through the soles of his boots before anyone else seemed to register the shift. It wasn't dramatic. Not yet. Just a subtle hum that traveled along metal framing. He raised his hand again, slower this time. Marla didn't bother masking her irritation. "Yes, there's a load issue in that design," he said calmly. "Eastern beams undersupported. If the storm intensifies, that span won't distribute weight evenly. Silence. Then a sharp laugh from somewhere near the front. "And you determined that from?" Marla tilted her head, eyebrows arched. From experience, he replied simply. The word hung there, unadorned. Experience meant something different in that room. For some, it meant board memberships and development portfolios. For him, it meant nights without sleep under collapsing structures overseas. It meant memorizing the sound steel makes seconds before failure. It meant knowing when to speak and when to brace. Marla turned back to the microphone. "We've hired licensed consultants," she said, tone clipped now. "Let's not derail the agenda." He didn't push further. He didn't need to. Because the storm outside had already decided the agenda would change. A louder crack of thunder rolled across the sky, rattling window frames. Parents shifted uneasily. A teacher glanced upward. Elias's gaze never left the ceiling. He wasn't looking for validation anymore. He was waiting. The thunder didn't fade. It pressed closer, rolling above the auditorium like something alive. A faint vibration passed through the metal rafters again, longer this time. Not loud enough to alarm anyone who didn't know what it meant. But he knew. Marla continued speaking about capital campaigns as if the sky itself had RSVP'd to her event. Elias leaned down toward Lila. "Go stand near the side exit," he said gently. "Just in case." Her brows knit together. "Is it gonna? I just want you somewhere easy to reach. Okay?" She nodded, trusting him the way only a child can. Vice Principal Vale stepped closer to him, lowering her voice. "You're serious about that beam?" "I wouldn't have said it if I wasn't," he replied quietly. His eyes tracked the seam where two panels met. That design adds weight without redistributing stress. If wind pressure hits from the east side, it'll torque, she swallowed. The consultants didn't mention that. They didn't look long enough. Another tremor rippled above them. This time, a few heads turned. On stage, Superintendent Klein cleared his throat. "Let's wrap up before the weather worsens." The lights flickered once. The room shifted from comfortable to uncertain in a single breath. Marla's smile faltered. "Maintenance?" she called sharply as if summoning an invisible team. He stepped forward instinctively. "I'm here." A metallic snap echoed overhead, sharp and unmistakable. Dust sifted down in a pale cloud near the stage curtains. Gasps scattered across the chairs. "That's not normal," someone whispered. He was already moving. "Everyone stay calm," he said, voice steady but carrying. "We need to clear the center section. Move toward the side exits. No running." The authority in his tone cut through the noise faster than the microphone ever had. Parents hesitated only a second before obeying. Marla blinked at him, stunned. "What are you doing? You can't just. If that joint gives, the center span drops first." He answered without looking at her. "We don't have time to debate." Another crack, louder now. A thin fracture line zigzagged across one ceiling panel. Superintendent Klein stared upward, color draining from his face. "Call emergency services. They won't get here fast enough," Elias said. "We stabilize first. You?" Marla's voice trembled between disbelief and fear. He met her gaze briefly, not with anger, not with triumph, just clarity. "Yes." He grabbed a portable ladder from the side wall and motioned to two custodial staff members. "Help me secure the eastern brace." They moved without question. Vice Principal Vale turned to the crowd. "Please follow instructions." Quickly. Rain hammered the windows now, relentless. He climbed the ladder with practiced ease, boots steady despite the shaking frame. From above, the problem was worse than he'd thought. The mounting plate had already begun to shear at the bolt line. He calculated angles, weight distribution, remaining tolerance. "Get me the emergency support bars from the storage cage," he called down. One of the staff hesitated. "Those are old. They'll hold." Leela stood safely near the exit, eyes wide but fixed on him. She wasn't crying. She knew that look on his face, the focused one, the one he wore when something needed fixing and fear wasn't allowed in the room. A bolt snapped. The crowd screamed. The ceiling sagged visibly now, a heavy dip forming over the stage. "Move," he barked. Chairs scraped violently across the floor as people rushed toward the doors. Vice Principal Vale kept order with surprising firmness, guiding students out first. He wedged the first support bar into place, locking it against the failing joint. Muscles strained beneath his uniform. The metal groaned but stopped dipping, for the moment. Superintendent Klein stood frozen near the podium. "What do you need?" "Strong volunteers," he replied. And no one panicking. Klein swallowed hard and began shouting instructions. Marla hovered uselessly near the front row, her authority evaporating under the weight of physics. Another violent gust slammed against the building. The brace shuddered. He adjusted positioning by instinct, angling the bar to distribute lateral force instead of vertical compression. Years of training moved through him like muscle memory, desert heat, flood zones, collapsed warehouses. He had stood beneath worse than this. "Hold it steady," he called. Two fathers rushed forward to assist, gripping the ladder's base. The sagging slowed. The storm raged, but the structure steadied inch by inch. If you're still watching this unfold, subscribe right now, because what looks like a maintenance worker saving a ceiling is about to expose something much bigger. Below him, fear was turning into something else: recognition. Vice Principal Vale looked up at him differently now, not as staff, not as background, but as command. Sirens wailed faintly in the distance. He didn't look down. He didn't look at Marla. He focused on the beam. Because this wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about making sure every child walked out safely. And when the final support locked into place, the ceiling stopped moving altogether. Silence fell, heavy, stunned, reverent. Rain still pounded outside, but inside the building held, and every pair of eyes in that auditorium was now fixed on the man they'd laughed at 15 minutes earlier. The ceiling no longer sagged, but it wasn't safe. Not yet. The temporary braces groaned under pressure, metal vibrating against metal in short, nervous tremors. Dust hung in the air like pale smoke. Children clung to parents near the exits. No one spoke above a whisper. He remained on the ladder, one hand still pressed against the reinforced joint, feeling for shifts the way a physician feels for a pulse. "Is it stable?" Superintendent Klein asked, voice stripped of ceremony. "For now," he replied. "But that plate's compromised. We need to relieve lateral pressure before another gust hits." Klein nodded quickly. "Tell us what to do." The words settled into the room like a verdict. Marla stood a few feet away, rainwater streaking faintly across her blazer from when she'd rushed toward the stage. Her mouth opened once, then closed. The gold bracelet at her wrist trembled as she folded her arms, not in confidence, but in containment. He climbed down with measured steps. Everyone outside, he instructed again. "Keep distance from the east wall. It's bearing the stress." Parents obeyed instantly now. There was no hesitation, no soft laughter, no indulgent smiles. Vice Principal Vale guided the last of the students through the side exit. Leela paused just long enough to meet her father's eyes. Pride flickered there, steady and fierce. Emergency lights buzzed overhead as the main power flickered again. He moved toward the service corridor without waiting for permission. The narrow passage smelled of cleaning solvent and damp insulation. Fluorescent bulbs hummed faintly above exposed piping. He grabbed a heavy-duty ratchet strap and 2 industrial clamps from the maintenance rack. Klein followed close behind. Where did you learn to assess something like that so fast? He didn't slow. Structural load distribution isn't guesswork. That's not what I asked. He stopped briefly at the base of the access ladder leading to the catwalk. Rain hammered harder against the roof now, the sound amplified through sheet metal. I've seen worse, he said simply. Up on the catwalk, wind forced cold air through unseen seams. The compromised joint shuddered again as another gust slammed into the building. He secured the ratchet strap across the weakened bracket, tightening it with controlled precision. Each crank redistributed tension, pulling stress away from the fractured plate and into the secondary beam. Klein watched, silent. You're not just maintenance, the superintendent said quietly. A beat passed. I fix what's broken, he answered. Below them, firefighters rushed through the main doors, boots pounding against tile. Radios crackled. A captain shouted for status reports. He leaned over the railing. Structures temporarily stabilized, he called down. Eastern mounting plate sheared at bolt line. Don't remove these braces without secondary support in place. The fire captain looked up sharply. Who are you? Evening tech, the captain frowned. You talk like an engineer. He returned to tightening the final clamp. Because he was calculating again how long the temporary solution would hold, how much pressure remained, how many children had cleared the perimeter. The last strap locked with a metallic snap. The trembling eased. He descended the ladder just as firefighters began setting up additional bracing systems. Outside, rain soaked the pavement in silver sheets. Parents huddled beneath overhangs. Sirens echoed faintly down the street. Lila stood beside Vice Principal Vale, wrapped in a borrowed jacket too large for her shoulders. When he stepped through the exit doors, conversations halted mid-sentence. Marla approached him cautiously, heels splashing against puddles. Her expression had changed, not softened, not yet, but unsettled. You acted without authorization, she said, voice thin beneath the storm. He met her gaze evenly. Authorization doesn't stop steel from failing. She faltered. Superintendent Klein stepped between them, rain dripping from his hair. He likely prevented a collapse. Likely? Marla shot back, grasping for footing. We hired professionals for a reason. And they weren't here, Klein interrupted, sharper now. Lightning split the sky behind them, illuminating faces in brief white flashes. The fire captain approached, clipboard tucked under one arm. Whoever installed those interim supports knew exactly what they were doing. Bought us critical time. He nodded toward the single dad. Marla's eyes shifted from the captain to him and back again. The class divide that had felt so solid an hour ago now seemed thinner, like painted drywall hiding structural cracks. He crouched slightly to Leela's level. You okay? She nodded. I knew you'd fix it. Something inside him tightened, not from fear, but from memory. From years spent making sure other people's children walked out of unstable buildings alive. Vice Principal Vale stepped closer. You should probably tell them, she said quietly. Tell them what? Marla demanded. Vale held his gaze for a second longer than necessary. And in that pause, the room, no, the entire storm-soaked courtyard, waited for something larger than weather to break. And in that pause, the storm-soaked courtyard waited for something larger than weather to break. Rain streamed off the auditorium roof in steady sheets, pooling along the curb. Emergency lights painted the wet pavement in pulses of red and white. Firefighters moved with focused urgency, reinforcing the temporary supports he'd installed while murmuring low assessments to one another. Vice Principal Vale didn't look away from him. You should probably tell them, she repeated, softer this time. Tell them what? Marla demanded again, sharper now, as if authority could be reclaimed through volume alone. He straightened slowly, water dripping from the brim of his maintenance cap. "It's not important." The fire captain gave a short, disbelieving huff. "It is if you just prevented a structural failure with scrap equipment." Superintendent Klein folded his soaked jacket over his arm, studying the single dad with new intensity. "Mr. Rowan," he said carefully, "how did you know where the shear point would be?" He hesitated, not from fear, but from instinct. Old habits die hard. You don't lead with credentials, you lead with outcomes. "I've worked with load-bearing failures before," he replied. "Where?" Marla pressed, stepping closer despite the rain. "Because this isn't a guessing game." Lightning flared again, bright enough to turn the courtyard momentarily white. He exhaled slowly. "Army Corps of Engineers," he said. "Structural Operations Unit." 12 years. The words didn't land all at once. They settled in layers. Vice Principal Vale blinked first. The fire captain's posture shifted immediately, shoulders squaring in quiet recognition. Superintendent Klein's expression tightened, not with skepticism but with calculation of a different kind. Marla stared at him as if recalibrating a blueprint that no longer made sense. "You're telling me," she said carefully, "that you were military?" "Engineering officer," he clarified. "Disaster stabilization. Bridge failures. Collapsed facilities. Flood zones." Rain filled the silence between sentences. "And now you're—" She gestured vaguely toward his uniform, toward the mud on his boots. "Evening maintenance tech," he finished for her. The fire captain gave a low whistle. "That explains the strap angle." He didn't respond. Leela stepped closer to him, slipping her hand into his. "He fixes everything," she said simply. There was no bravado in her voice, just fact. Superintendent Klein glanced toward the building where crews were securing additional beams. "Why didn't we know about this?" He almost smiled. "You didn't ask." The storm began to taper slightly, rain softening from hammering sheets to steady fall. Sirens faded as the immediate dangers stabilized. Marla's heels sank slightly into the wet grass as she shifted her weight. "If you had that kind of background," she said, struggling to keep her tone even, "why would you take a maintenance job at a public school?" "Because combat ends. Because divorce happens. Because sometimes dignity looks quieter than rank." But he didn't say any of that. "It pays the bills," he answered. "And it keeps me near my daughter." Vice Principal Vale's eyes flickered at that. She had seen him stay late to finish repairs so events wouldn't be canceled. She had noticed how he arrived early to make sure the heating worked on winter mornings. Not once had he mentioned commendations. Not once had he corrected assumptions. The fire captain approached Superintendent Klein. "We'll need to close the auditorium until a full structural audit's done. Whoever approved those renovation additions missed a serious redistribution flaw." Marla stiffened. "The consultants we hired are certified." "Certified doesn't mean thorough," the captain replied evenly. Klein's gaze moved slowly from the damaged building to the single dad standing in the rain. Public exposure doesn't always happen on a stage. Sometimes it happens in puddles, under flashing lights, while reputations quietly rearrange themselves. Parents nearby had begun whispering. Words carried, Army engineer, saved the kids, why didn't anyone know? The same voices that had chuckled earlier now shifted with uncomfortable reflection. Marla crossed her arms tightly. "Well," she said, forcing composure back into place, "we're grateful for the assistance." Assistance. He let the word pass. Superintendent Klein cleared his throat. Grateful doesn't quite cover it. For a brief second, their eyes met. Not adversaries, not equals yet, but something changing. A school board member hurried across the courtyard with a tablet in hand. "Local news is already asking questions," she said breathlessly. Parents posted videos. Marla's head snapped up. Videos of what? Of him directing the evacuation. The wind lifted slightly, catching the edge of her blazer. The narrative she had carefully constructed about leadership, about funding tiers, about who belonged at the microphone, was shifting beyond her control. He looked at the auditorium doors, then back at the people standing in the rain. "I should check the secondary supports," he said calmly. "Storm's not done yet." Superintendent Klein nodded without hesitation. "Show me what you need." Marla opened her mouth again, but no words came. Because in that courtyard, under fading thunder and flashing lights, power had already moved. And it hadn't moved toward money. It had moved toward competence. Superintendent Klein didn't hesitate. He stepped beside the maintenance tech, beside the former engineer, and said, "What do you need?" The question carried weight. Not polite acknowledgement, not damage control, a direct request for leadership. Flashlights. 2 more support clamps. "Clear the west corridor," he answered, already walking back toward the auditorium doors, "and keep everyone outside the east perimeter." Klein turned immediately, repeating the instructions with urgency that hadn't been there earlier in the evening. Marla remained near the grass, rain streaking her carefully styled hair. "Howard, we need to consider liability. We need to consider gravity," he cut in sharply. The words hit harder than thunder. Inside, the auditorium smelled of damp insulation and hot metal. Firefighters had installed temporary braces, but the structure still groaned under wind pressure. He scanned the ceiling again, eyes narrowing at a secondary beam beginning to torque under redistributed load. "See that?" he called to the captain. "If that twists another inch, it'll transfer stress to the center span." The captain followed his gaze. "You're right." He climbed the ladder without ceremony. Boots steady. Movements efficient. The catwalk swayed slightly as wind battered the roof. Below, Superintendent Klein stood with a flashlight angled upward, illuminating the exact bracket he indicated. Not once did he question the instruction. Outside, parents pressed closer to the windows despite the rain. Phones lifted. Recording. Public exposure isn't always a speech. Sometimes it's silent footage of someone doing what others can't. He secured another clamp, tightening it with precise torque. His hands moved with practiced rhythm, measure, brace, adjust, secure. The language of structure was familiar, almost comforting. The beam steadied. "Good," the fire captain muttered. "That buys us more time." He descended the ladder again, wiping rain from his brow with the back of his wrist. Marla stood just inside the doorway now, heels echoing against tile. "Is this really necessary?" she asked, voice thinner than before. The consultant said the upgrades were compliant. He didn't look at her. Compliance doesn't account for wind shear during active load increase. She blinked. English. "It wasn't built to carry what you planned to add," he said plainly. Her jaw tightened. The additions were approved by the board, and the board trusted a blueprint missing reinforcement, he replied evenly. The fire captain glanced between them, understanding the subtext. If he hadn't spotted that flaw tonight, we'd be evacuating under collapse conditions. The word collapse hung heavy. Marla swallowed. Outside, reporters began gathering beneath umbrellas, cameras angled toward the entrance. Vice Principal Vale approached quietly. Media's asking who led the evacuation. Superintendent Klein looked at him, then back at her. "Tell them the truth." Marla's eyes widened. "We don't need headlines about structural failures. We need headlines about prevention." Klein responded. He felt the shift fully now. Not just in the building, but in authority. Leela stepped carefully through the doorway, jacket slipping from her shoulders. "Dad?" He turned immediately. "You're supposed to stay outside." "I know," she said softly, "but they're saying you saved everyone." A flicker crossed his face, Not pride. Not triumph. Just relief that she was safe enough to say it. "I just did my job," he told her. "No," she whispered, "you did more." If you're still here watching this unfold, subscribe now, because what happens next isn't just about beams and bolts. It's about what people choose to see when the storm passes. Reporters edged closer, microphones extending cautiously inside the doorway. "Sir," one called out toward the fire captain, who directed the evacuation. The captain didn't hesitate. He pointed directly at the maintenance tech. Cameras shifted instantly. Marla stepped back as lenses swung toward the man she'd dismissed hours earlier. "Can you state your name?" a reporter asked. He hesitated for half a breath. He hadn't worn rank in years, hadn't been called officer in longer. Titles felt unnecessary now. But truth wasn't optional. "Elias," he said first, then steadied. "Former Army Corps of Engineers." The courtyard quieted despite the rain. Superintendent Klein inhaled slowly. Marla's composure cracked just slightly, because this wasn't a narrative she controlled anymore. This was poetic justice unfolding in real time, built not from revenge, but from competence. The storm lessened further, rain thinning to a mist. Firefighters confirmed the structure would hold until full reinforcement arrived. He stepped outside again, water soaking into worn leather boots. Parents parted instinctively to make room. The same space that had once held laughter now held something else entirely: respect. And for the first time that night, Marla Whitcomb had nothing left to say. Rain softened into a fine mist, drifting through the beams of emergency lights like ash after a fire. Parents clustered beneath umbrellas and overhangs, whispering in low tones that carried farther than they intended. Cameras remained trained on the entrance, red recording lights steady and unblinking. Elias stood near the base of the steps, water dripping from his sleeves, breathing finally evening out. The immediate danger had passed, but his mind was still mapping stress points, calculating what unseen weaknesses might remain. The fire captain approached with a clipboard tucked beneath his arm. "Structures holding with the additional bracing," he said. But whoever reviewed those renovation plans missed a critical redistribution flaw. "That's not small." Superintendent Klein's jaw tightened. The district approved them based on consultant assurances. The captain nodded once, then looked at Elias. "You caught it in minutes," he shrugged lightly. The beam was speaking. Most people just weren't listening. Marla shifted near the doorway, arms wrapped around herself now more for warmth than posture. "This isn't the time for blame," she said carefully. "We need to focus on solutions. Solutions start with honesty," Vice Principal Vale replied quietly. That landed harder than accusation. A reporter stepped forward, careful not to cross the taped perimeter. "Mr. Rowan," she called. "How did you recognize the failure risk so quickly?" He hesitated. He'd never been fond of cameras. The work mattered more than the recognition. But silence now would only allow someone else to shape the narrative. "Load-bearing structures fail in patterns," he said calmly. "When you've seen enough of them under stress, you learn the sound before the break." The courtyard stilled again. Another reporter lifted a microphone. "Were you involved in similar emergency responses during your military service?" A flicker of old memory passed behind his eyes: sandstorms, collapsed roofs, shouting over rotor blades. "Yes," he answered simply. Superintendent Klein stepped closer, standing beside him rather than behind. The positioning wasn't accidental. "Mr. Rowan's quick action prevented a potential catastrophe tonight," he said, voice firm enough to carry. "We are grateful." Grateful. The word echoed differently this time. Marla's gaze darted between cameras and faces in the crowd. Parents who had once nodded at her fundraising speeches were now looking at someone else entirely. The axis of authority had shifted, not through argument but through action. One father in the crowd called out, "You should have been leading the renovation review." Murmurs of agreement followed. Marla stiffened. "The board follows procedure, and procedure almost cost us," another parent replied. The tension no longer hid beneath politeness. Poetic justice rarely announces itself. It reveals itself when comparison becomes unavoidable. Vice Principal Vale stepped forward, holding a damp copy of the renovation blueprint. "The eastern reinforcement beam wasn't included in the revised plan," she said clearly. He noticed it from the back row. A back row. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. Superintendent Klein looked down at the blueprint, then back at Elias. "Would you be willing to consult on the structural reassessment?" The question drew a sharp intake of breath from Marla. He paused. Consulting meant stepping into rooms that had previously dismissed him. It meant scrutiny, politics, perhaps resentment. It also meant safety. "I'll review it," he said. "For the school. Not for pride, not for revenge. For the children who filled those halls every morning." Leela edged closer to his side, slipping her small hand into his again. She stood taller now, chin lifted. Around them, parents whispered his name with a different tone, curiosity replaced by respect. Marla cleared her throat, forcing composure back into place. "We'll conduct a full internal review," she announced, voice regaining some strength. "If there were oversights, they'll be addressed." "If." The fire captain gave her a measured look but said nothing. A gust of wind rattled loose caution tape, snapping it against metal barricades. The storm was nearly past, but its aftermath lingered in the soaked earth and unsettled air. Superintendent Klein extended his hand toward Elias. For a fraction of a second, the courtyard seemed to hold its breath. He shook it. The gesture was simple, public, undeniable. Cameras captured it from 3 angles. The superintendent's voice lowered, just enough that only those closest could hear. "I misjudged you," he answered evenly. "You didn't know me." "That's not an excuse," Klein replied. Nearby, Marla's expression hardened, not in defiance, but in dawning awareness. Influence built on perception is fragile when truth enters the room. Parents began dispersing slowly as firefighters packed equipment. The building, though wounded, stood firm. As the mist thinned and night settled heavier over the campus, one thing had become unmistakably clear. The man they had laughed at no longer stood in the back row. And everyone knew it. The mist thinned into a cold drizzle as emergency vehicles began pulling away one by one, their sirens fading into distant echoes. The flashing lights disappeared, leaving only the glow of street lamps reflecting off soaked pavement. Parents lingered in small clusters, voices quieter now, not frantic, but thoughtful. Elias remained near the steps, scanning the roofline one last time out of habit. The braces were holding. The wind had weakened. Structural risk had dropped from imminent to manageable. Superintendent Klein stepped beside him again, hands tucked into damp coat pockets. "The board's going to demand answers by morning," he said quietly. "They should," Elias replied. Klein glanced at him. "The consultant signed off on that reinforcement plan 3 weeks ago. And no one stress-tested it against increased load," he answered evenly. "You saw that from the back row. I've spent years studying failure points," he said. "You learn to notice what others overlook." Behind them, Marla spoke in hushed tones with 2 board members. Her posture had shifted from commanding to controlled containment, damage mitigation mode. But even from a distance, the change was visible. She wasn't directing the conversation anymore. She was responding to it. Vice Principal Vale approached, holding her tablet. "Local media already posted footage," she said. They're calling it a maintenance worker averts collapse. Klein exhaled slowly. That headline won't sit well with certain people. It's accurate, she replied. Accuracy has weight. A few parents began approaching Elias directly now, not with skepticism, with gratitude. You kept my son calm, one mother said, voice thick. Thank you. You told us exactly where to stand, another added. You sounded like you'd done that before, he nodded politely. I'm glad everyone's safe. No embellishment. No performance. Leela watched from his side, eyes bright in the glow of the streetlight. She'd never seen adults look at her father this way. Not as background staff, not as the man who fixed flickering bulbs, but as someone essential. Marla finally stepped forward, heels clicking softly against wet concrete. The crowd quieted slightly as she approached. Her expression was composed again, but thinner, like glass stretched too tight. Mr. Rowan, she began, voice steady but measured, we're all relieved no one was hurt. Yes, he replied. She hesitated. Pride is loud when secure, it's quiet when shaken. The board will initiate a review of the structural plan, she continued. We appreciate your input tonight. Appreciate, not apology, not yet. He met her gaze calmly. The building deserves more than appreciation. It deserves accuracy. A subtle murmur moved through the parents nearby. Superintendent Klein cleared his throat. Tomorrow morning, I'm convening an emergency facilities meeting. I'd like you there. Marla's head snapped slightly in his direction. Howard. He should be there, Klein said firmly. The public shift solidified in that moment. Authority wasn't being challenged. It was being redistributed. Elias didn't answer immediately. He looked at the school building, the cracked panel still visible above the entrance, temporary braces silhouetted against dim interior lights. I'll come, he said finally. For the kids. Vice Principal Vale's lips curved faintly at that. Marla folded her arms, but there was no bite left in the gesture. Cameras had captured too much. Witnesses had seen too clearly. The narrative had already escaped her control. One of the board members approached cautiously. Were you really Army Corps? Yes. Rank? He hesitated a fraction of a second. That life felt distant now. A different uniform. A different battlefield. Captain, he said. The word settled differently than before. Not boastful, not whispered, just fact. A few parents exchanged glances. The title carried weight, even without volume. Klein extended his hand again, not for cameras this time, but for acknowledgement. Thank you, Captain. There it was, not Mr. Rowan, not maintenance. Captain. Marla's composure cracked almost imperceptibly at the edges. Because the superintendent hadn't whispered it, he'd said it clearly. In front of everyone. The drizzle slowed to scattered drops. Clouds began to thin overhead, revealing fragments of night sky. Parents slowly began leading their children to cars. The courtyard emptied in quiet reverence rather than chaos. Leela squeezed his hand. They know now, she said softly. He looked down at her, then back at the school. Yes, he replied. They knew, not because he argued, not because he demanded recognition, but because when the structure failed, he didn't. The courtyard had nearly emptied, leaving behind only damp pavement and the faint metallic scent of rain-soaked steel. Emergency crews finished packing their equipment, engines rumbling softly before pulling away. The school stood quiet now, wounded but upright, temporary braces visible through the tall auditorium windows like ribs beneath skin. Superintendent Klein lingered beside him. Facilities meeting. 7 a.m., he said. Boardroom. Elias nodded once. I'll be there. Marla remained a few steps away, speaking sharply into her phone. Fragments of her conversation drifted across the damp air, consultant liability, structural review, media narrative. Each word sounded smaller than it had earlier in the evening. Vice Principal Vale approached, lowering her voice. "You realize tomorrow won't just be technical." He gave a faint, knowing look. "It never is. Power rarely surrenders without resistance." Lila tugged gently at his sleeve. "Are we going home?" "In a minute," he said softly. He turned his attention back to the building, eyes tracing the roofline one more time. Even stabilized, it would need reinforcement. A full audit. Revised load distribution, proper bracing. He could already see the corrections in his mind. Marla ended her call and stepped closer, posture regained but not fully restored. "Captain," she began carefully, testing the word as if unsure it belonged to him, "tomorrow's meeting will address procedural missteps." Structural missteps he corrected evenly. A flicker of irritation crossed her face. The board approved those plans unanimously. Based on incomplete analysis, she folded her arms again. "You're implying negligence. I'm stating physics." The simplicity of the reply unsettled her more than accusation would have. Superintendent Klein interjected before the exchange could harden. "We'll sort facts in the morning." Elias nodded. "Facts are fine." Parents still nearby watched the conversation unfold, their expressions thoughtful rather than reactive. Word had traveled quickly, about the beam, about the evacuation, about the former Army engineer standing in maintenance boots. The social ripple had begun. A local reporter approached cautiously once more. "Captain Rowan," she said, more formally this time, "will you be involved in reviewing the renovation oversight?" He glanced briefly at Marla before answering. "If they ask for my assessment, I'll give it." The reporter's pen moved quickly. "If you're still here watching this shift unfold, subscribe now, because what happens in that boardroom tomorrow will decide more than just beams and brackets." Marla's jaw tightened at the word subscribe, echoing from someone's phone, replaying footage nearby. The narrative was no longer curated by press releases. It was carried by witnesses. The last of the emergency lights shut off, plunging the courtyard into the softer glow of street lamps. The storm clouds finally began to break apart, revealing a thin line of stars overhead. Vice Principal Vale stepped closer to him once more. "You handled that with more restraint than most would have." "It wasn't about them," he said quietly. "It felt personal." He looked at Lila. "It is." Marla overheard that, and something flickered in her expression, recognition, perhaps, that the stakes she treated as professional were, for him, deeply human. Superintendent Klein extended his hand one final time before leaving. 7 a.m., Captain." He shook it firmly. The word no longer sounded foreign in the air. As the last parents drove away, the courtyard emptied entirely. Only the three of them remained, Marla, the superintendent walking toward his car, and the single dad standing beside his daughter. Marla broke the silence. "You could have mentioned your background before tonight." He considered that for a moment. "I raised my hand," he said. The statement landed with quiet force. She had no response. Because that was the truth. Lila slipped her hand into his again, and together they began walking toward the parking lot. His truck sat under a flickering lamp, older, modest, practical. Beside it, Marla's luxury sedan gleamed under rainwater. 2 vehicles. 2 worlds. Only one of them had stabilized the building. As he opened the passenger door for his daughter, he looked once more at the school silhouetted against clearing skies. Tomorrow wouldn't be about survival. It would be about accountability, and this time the entire district would be watching. Morning came gray and heavy, the sky still bruised from the night before. Rainwater clung to the edges of the school roof, dripping steadily onto the pavement below. Yellow caution tape stretched across the auditorium entrance, fluttering in a faint breeze. Elias parked his truck in the same staff space he used every day. No reserved placard. No priority access. Just oil-stained asphalt and faded white lines. He stepped out, tool bag slung over his shoulder out of habit, even though today wasn't about repairs. It was about review. Parents had already gathered near the entrance, some holding coffee cups, others scrolling through phones. When they noticed him, conversations paused, not awkwardly but attentively. "Morning, Captain," one father said quietly. He inclined his head in acknowledgement. The title still felt strange in this parking lot. Leela walked beside him, backpack resting against her small shoulders. "They're going to listen today," she said. "They'll hear," he corrected gently. Inside, the administrative wing buzzed with unusual tension. Staff moved briskly. Doors opened and shut in quick succession. The boardroom at the end of the corridor stood partially ajar, voices already rising inside. Superintendent Klein stood near the head of the long oak table, sleeves rolled, tie loosened. Marla Whitcomb sat 2 seats down, posture rigid, a stack of documents neatly arranged before her. 2 board members flanked her, whispering in low tones. Vice Principal Vale noticed him first. "He's here," she said quietly. The room shifted. Not dramatically, not theatrically, just enough. Klein gestured toward an open chair near the center of the table. Not the far end, not the back wall. The center. He set his tool bag gently beside the chair, but remained standing. "Before we begin," he said evenly, "I'd like to review the structural addendum from last month." Marla's eyes narrowed slightly. "Our consultants prepared that, and I'd like to review it." There was no aggression in his tone, only certainty. A board member slid the blueprint across the polished surface toward him. The paper looked pristine compared to the dust-coated copy from the night before. He studied it silently, tracing beam lines with steady fingers. "The eastern reinforcement is absent," he said after a moment. Load increase from lighting rigs wasn't compensated. "Our consultants determined the existing structure was sufficient," Marla replied. "For standard load," he answered. "Not storm-amplified lateral stress," one board member shifted uncomfortably. "Are you saying the renovation plan was unsafe?" "I'm saying it was incomplete." The distinction mattered. Superintendent Klein leaned forward. "Can you demonstrate that?" He reached into his bag and removed a small notepad and pencil. No presentation slides, no projector, just calculation. He sketched a simplified diagram of the auditorium support system, labeling force directions, stress points, redistribution vectors. His handwriting was precise, disciplined. When wind pressure hit from the east, he explained calmly, it created torque along this bracket. Without a secondary beam here, stress concentrated at the bolt line. He tapped the spot. That's where it sheared. Silence filled the boardroom. Marla crossed her arms, but it wasn't defensive now, it was protective. "The consultants have years of certification, and I have years of collapse response," he replied quietly. Vice Principal Vale nodded faintly. One board member cleared his throat. "If what you're saying is accurate, this oversight could have resulted in a structural failure during a student assembly." "Yes." No embellishment. Just yes. The weight of it pressed against the polished oak table. Outside the boardroom window, parents lingered along the walkway, glancing toward the closed door. Word had spread that the meeting would determine accountability. Public exposure doesn't require cameras when the stakes are children. Marla inhaled slowly. "Are you suggesting we terminate the consultants?" "I'm suggesting you review every calculation," he said, "and correct the design before adding another pound of weight." The calmness of his delivery stripped the room of defensiveness. There was no accusation, only responsibility. Superintendent Klein sat back, exhaling slowly. "We're commissioning an independent structural audit immediately." Marla's gaze flickered toward him, startled. "Howard, we were fortunate last night," he said firmly. "We won't rely on fortune again." The shift solidified. Authority had realigned not through humiliation, but through undeniable competence. He closed the blueprint gently. "For what it's worth," he added, voice steady, "this school deserves infrastructure that protects every child inside it." That's not political. That's structural. No one argued. Because numbers don't bend to pride. And for the first time in that boardroom, Marla Whitcomb had to confront something wealth couldn't reinforce. She had been wrong. The realization didn't explode across the boardroom. It settled slowly, like dust after impact. Marla Whitcomb sat still, fingers resting against the stack of consultant documents she had defended so confidently only hours earlier. The polished oak table reflected the overhead lights, steady and unforgiving. Superintendent Klein broke the silence first. "We're suspending the renovation expansion until an independent audit confirms structural integrity," he said firmly. Effective immediately. One board member nodded. Another scribbled notes without looking up. Marla inhaled, straightening slightly. "Howard, halting the project will cost us donor confidence. It will cost us more if we don't," he replied. The words carried weight now, not political weight, structural weight. Elias remained standing beside his chair, hands resting lightly against the backrest. He wasn't looming. He wasn't posturing. He was simply present. Marla finally looked directly at him, not over him, not past him. "At last night's meeting," she began carefully, "I dismissed your concerns." The room stilled. She didn't glance at the board. She didn't glance at Klein. She kept her eyes on the man in the maintenance uniform. That was premature. It wasn't a full apology yet. But it was the first fracture in her armor. He didn't respond immediately. He wasn't interested in vindication for its own sake. "The building doesn't care who speaks," he said calmly. "It only responds to stress." A faint ripple of understanding moved through the room. Vice Principal Vale folded her hands together. "The stress wasn't just on steel," she added quietly. Marla's jaw tightened, but she didn't argue. Superintendent Klein stood slowly from his seat. "Last night," he said, voice measured, "Mr. Rowan prevented what could have been a catastrophic failure during a student event. That fact deserves acknowledgement." He stepped around the table, positioning himself beside Elias rather than behind it. In the hallway outside, footsteps paused. Staff members had gathered discreetly beyond the partially opened door. Klein extended his hand once more, not for negotiation, not for optics, for recognition. "Captain," he said clearly. The word carried beyond the boardroom. It reached the hallway. It reached the parents standing near the entrance. It reached Leela, waiting anxiously on a bench outside the administrative wing. Elias met his hand firmly. "Sir," Klein added. The title hung in the air like a recalibration of gravity. Marla's breath caught, not audibly but visibly. Because the superintendent hadn't whispered it. He had said it with clarity, and everyone within earshot had heard. Public exposure is complete when truth becomes common knowledge. A board member rose next. "On behalf of this district," he said, "we thank you for your service, both past and present service." The word meant more to him than rank ever had. He inclined his head slightly. "I'm glad no one was hurt. That was because of you," Vice Principal Vale said softly. Outside, murmurs began to ripple through the hallway. Word traveled quickly the superintendent had addressed the maintenance tech as captain. "As sir." Marla stood slowly, smoothing her blazer as if restoring composure through fabric. She stepped forward until she stood only a few feet from him. I let assumptions speak for me, she said quietly. That won't happen again. It wasn't theatrical. It wasn't dramatic. It was real. He studied her for a long second. Assumptions are easy, he replied evenly. Responsibility isn't. She nodded once. The boardroom door opened fully now, and staff members no longer pretended not to listen. Superintendent Klein cleared his throat. Effective immediately, Captain Rowan will serve as structural consultant for the remainder of this project. There it was. Not symbolic. Not honorary. Official. A maintenance technician invited into leadership, not because of charity, but because of competence. Marla exhaled slowly, then gave a small, deliberate nod. I support that. The shift was complete. Poetic justice doesn't humiliate. It corrects imbalance. As Elias stepped away from the table, he caught sight of Lila standing at the end of the hallway. Her eyes were wide, shining. She had heard. He walked toward her, boots steady against polished tile. Behind him, the boardroom continued discussing audits and revisions. But the axis had moved. Not toward wealth, not toward influence, toward integrity. And in the hallway of the school he quietly maintained every evening, the superintendent's voice echoed one last time. Thank you, sir. This time no one laughed. The hallway didn't erupt into applause. It didn't need to. The silence carried more weight than noise ever could. Staff members who had once hurried past him with polite nods now stood still, meeting his eyes with something steadier. Respect earned, not assumed. Leela didn't hesitate. She ran the last few steps and wrapped her arms around his waist. They called you sir, she whispered against his jacket. He rested a hand gently on the back of her head. They did. Her voice carried pride, not surprise. I knew they would. Behind them, Superintendent Klein stepped into the hallway. Captain, he said, more conversational now, we'll coordinate the independent audit this afternoon. I'd value your input on selecting the firm. Elias nodded. I'll review their credentials. Marla followed a few seconds later. The confidence she wore yesterday hadn't vanished, but it had shifted. Less performative, more deliberate. She stopped a few feet from him, hands loosely clasped. I owe you more than procedural acknowledgement, she said quietly. Last night, I reduced your expertise to your uniform. He didn't interrupt. I won't pretend that was accidental, she continued. It wasn't. Honesty sounds different when it costs something. Vice Principal Vale watched from nearby, arms folded but expression open. Marla inhaled slowly. I built my career believing leadership looks a certain way, that influence carries authority. Last night proved otherwise. He studied her for a long moment. Leadership isn't about volume, he said evenly. It's about who stands steady when pressure hits. Her lips pressed together briefly. You stood steady, so did the firefighters, so did the teachers guiding students out, you directed them. He shrugged faintly. Experience does that. The conversation wasn't heated. It wasn't triumphant. It was balanced. Outside the administrative wing windows, parents gathered again, drawn by updates spreading through group chats and social feeds. Word had reached them. The renovation was halted. The audit commissioned. The consultant under review. And the maintenance tech, captain, had been placed in charge of structural oversight. The social ripple widened. One board member approached cautiously. We'll be issuing a public statement by noon, he said. Transparency matters. Yes, Elias replied. It does. Marla straightened slightly. I'll address the oversight directly, she added. No deflection. Vice Principal Vale's brows lifted faintly, impressed. Accountability doesn't weaken authority, it rebuilds it. Lila stepped back, looking between the adults. Does that mean the school's safe now? He crouched slightly to meet her eyes. It means we're making it safer. She nodded, satisfied. Superintendent Klein glanced toward the auditorium corridor. The temporary supports are holding. Structural engineers are en route. Good, he answered. Marla hesitated once more. For what it's worth, she said carefully, your daughter should be proud. She is, he replied softly. Leela grinned openly. A group of teachers approached then, math, science, literature, faces lined with exhaustion but softened by relief. We heard what happened in there, one of them said. Thank you. Another added, you didn't have to stay quiet yesterday. But you did. He considered that. I didn't need to speak loudly, he said. I just needed to speak accurately. The teachers exchanged glances. Accuracy had saved them. As the hallway slowly resumed its rhythm, phones ringing, doors opening, announcements echoing faintly over the intercom, the energy felt different. Lighter. Not because the crisis hadn't been serious, but because it had revealed something necessary. Marla extended her hand at last, not for optics, not for cameras. For the record, she said quietly, I'm sorry. He shook her hand. Not as a subordinate, not as an adversary, as an equal. The apology didn't erase the earlier laughter. It didn't undo the humiliation, but it acknowledged it, and acknowledgement restores dignity faster than silence ever could. Vice Principal Vale smiled faintly. Looks like we all learned something. Yes, he agreed. Pressure reveals structure. Outside, sunlight finally began breaking through thinning clouds, casting pale gold across the school facade. The caution tape fluttered gently in the breeze, no longer frantic. Parents began dispersing with calmer expressions. Teachers returned to classrooms. The district's public statement began drafting in real time. In the quiet that followed, one truth remained solid as reinforced steel. Power had shifted, not because someone demanded it, but because someone earned it. Power had shifted not because someone demanded it, but because someone earned it. By late afternoon, sunlight washed clean across the school's brick exterior, drying the last traces of the storm. The caution tape had been removed from the auditorium entrance, replaced with temporary signage announcing the independent structural audit. Workers moved with deliberate care, installing additional reinforcements under Elias's measured supervision. He stood near the entrance with a clipboard in hand, not ornamental, not symbolic, functional. Notes marked in precise handwriting, load corrections calculated, beam replacements scheduled. Parents approached throughout the day, not out of curiosity anymore, but with gratitude. One father paused beside him. I used to think leadership meant who talked the loudest, he admitted. Guess I was wrong. Elias offered a faint nod. Leadership listens first. Inside the administrative office, Superintendent Klein finalized the district's public statement. It acknowledged the oversight. It named the independent audit firm. And it formally appointed Captain Rowan as structural consultant until completion of the renovation review. The announcement spread quickly, not because it was dramatic, but because it was honest. Marla Whitcomb stood at the auditorium doorway as workers secured the final temporary brace. Her posture had softened, not diminished, but recalibrated. She stepped toward him once more. The consultants have agreed to cooperate fully, she said. Their contract is under review. That's good, he replied. She hesitated, then added, I've scheduled a parent forum next week. Open floor. No scripted agenda. He glanced at her, registering the significance of that shift. That's responsible. A small smile touched her lips. It's necessary. Nearby, Leela sat on the auditorium steps, swinging her legs lightly as she watched her father work. A few classmates hovered around her now, whispering excitedly. That's your dad? One asked. She nodded proudly. He fixes things. Simple, true. The fire captain from the night before stopped by briefly, offering a firm handshake before leaving. "Glad to see it handled right," he said. "Me too," Elias replied. As evening approached, the school gradually returned to its usual rhythm. Lockers clanged, buses idled, teachers gathered papers. But beneath the ordinary hum, something had changed. The back row no longer felt like exile. It felt like perspective. Vice Principal Vale joined him at the entrance as the final workers packed up. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "you could have left years ago. Taken a higher-paying role somewhere else." He looked at the building, then at his daughter laughing on the steps. "Some structures are worth maintaining," he answered. She smiled. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the courtyard where laughter had once echoed at his expense. That memory remained, but it no longer carried sting. It carried contrast. Marla approached one last time before heading to her car. "Captain," she said, the word now steady and unforced, "thank you for holding us accountable." He met her gaze evenly. Accountability keeps structure standing. She nodded once and walked away. Leela ran up beside him, slipping her hand into his as she had the night before. "Are we going home?" "Yeah," he said softly. They walked toward his truck together, past polished sedans, past manicured hedges, past the auditorium that now bore reinforced steel where weakness once hid. He paused for a moment before opening the passenger door, not to admire victory, not to savor vindication, but to listen. The building was quiet, stable, safe. He opened the door for his daughter, then looked once more at the school framed against the fading light. Yesterday they mocked a single dad at a parent meeting. Today, the superintendent called him Sir. This wasn't a story about a meeting. It was about dignity under pressure. It was about how real strength doesn't announce itself. It reveals itself when the weight hits hardest. And it was about what happens when assumptions collapse before steel does. If this story moved you, ask me for the next story title. Subscribe, and don't miss our next story. A single dad gave his last $20 to a stranger. The next morning his name was on the company door. Trust me, you'll feel it. And tell me in the comments, what injustice should we tackle next?